Quick signature here. So this is Ryan Jordan interviewing Professor Robinson. Thank you, Professor Robinson. On May the 12th at, what time are we at? About
12:48.
12:48
Yeah.
in the afternoon. So we'll just jump right in here. So in your experience, does Cal State East Bay encourage academic diversity in students? Why or why not?
Yes, I think they do. I think they encourage diversity in their outreach to students by making it really clear in all of their sort of public literature, posters, etc., that everybody's welcome and everybody's valued. I think we also have a bunch of support programs that we put in place for freshmen, especially to help different students get plugged in to the community on campus, and our cluster program is set up to facilitate that. So that was the class that I just taught, was one of the freshman clusters. I think it does a good job of sort of connecting students to other students to help them just stay connected and feel that they belong at the university, which really helps performance, retention, graduation, all that kind of stuff. So, yes.
And do you also find that that Cal State East Bay encourages students to sort of explore, sort of express their own interests academically as well? Maybe like going outside the academic norms or convention and stuff like that?
Probably. I'm not really sure. I think so. Not really sure what that experience is like for students as much. In terms of the classroom, we do have some sort of freedom for creativity of assignment type and that kind of stuff. In terms of campus life, I think there are a lot of opportunities for different clubs and events and that kind of stuff. I would hope that is how students perceive it as well, but I'm not really sure.
Cool. And so how do you encourage diversity in academic thought in students? And what sort of means do you use to encourage students to pursue and express their own unique ideas through academic work, like in your teaching methods in the classroom?
So in my classes, I try to emphasize perspective through the sort of methodology of discussion and everything, but basically by teaching a critical evaluation of sources through basic historical methodology. Almost the first issue that one is confronted with is to try to identify the perspective and the motives of a text or an image or an archaeological artifact or something, right? And so a lot of our historical discussions center around trying to identify motives, audiences, values, that kind of stuff. And that I try to make that sort of transition smoothly into a discussion of identifying our own motives and values and perspectives. So it's kind of built into my curriculum at least as I see it ideally functioning. The methodology is to identify perspective and motivation for the subject matter that we're studying, and so it sort of naturally bleeds over into identifying that in ourselves. And so then, through discussion, sometimes more or less successfully, I try to draw that out of students and give them a time to express that, right? So what is your perspective? We were just talking about the trade-off between family loyalty and sort of state loyalty or government loyalty, right? Does the law work for us, or do we work for the law? And obviously different people from different cultures have really different perspectives and experiences of totalitarian states or, supposedly free societies. And so hopefully in those conversations, students are able to express, their own perspectives on these issues.
Cool, thank you. And in the cases where students might be a little hesitant or reluctant to sort of engage in, that sort of diverse thought or exploring those processes or those themes, how do you handle that and trying to draw that out of students if they're a bit reluctant to engage in that sort of discussion and stuff like that?
Yeah, that's tough. Generally, when it's real quiet like that, I think by opening up, sort of giving some class time to just small kind of conversations among students, so that students can sort of talk to each other about ideas more easily than they can raise their hand and stand up and sort of talk to the whole class. So by creating more kind of smaller, intimate conversation settings in the classroom. And I think that helps. I don't know that necessarily, gets everyone to be able to participate, but it helps.
Okay, cool. I was going to talk about your Ancient Egypt course, which is the class I had experience. I took because it was very, very, very fun and interesting. I had a really good time in there. In your Ancient Egypt course, you focus on the unique cultural beliefs and structure of Egypt, which in itself is pretty unique to the ancient world. So how does that link to your ideas of diversity and the importance of students' understanding of the ancient world and just sort of cultures in general?
Can you read it again? Sorry.
Sure. Yeah, no worries. In the Ancient Egypt course, you focus on the unique cultural beliefs and structure of Egypt, which is quite unique to other cultures in the ancient world. And so how does that approach that you take to presenting Ancient Egypt to students link to your ideas of diversity and the importance of students' understanding of the ancient world and cultures in general?
Yeah.
That's sort of a big question.
Well, that is kind of the fun game of history for me, which is to look at how, in some sense, bizarrely different all of the world's cultures and civilizations have been, and yet how similar certain patterns, or certain categories at least of patterns are. Which is to say, that like the highest degree of diversity that we can ever encounter is in the study of history, because we encounter not only the cultures of those who are in the room with us and the scholars that we read and that kind of stuff, but we encounter these ancient societies that have like really different ideas and really different beliefs and really different practices and stuff that horrifies us. And when they're killing their palace staff to bury them in their own tombs with them so they can go to the afterlife together. I mean, we wouldn't be able to get that through Congress today, right? That's an important... Whatever. We encounter this like dramatic difference in the past. And so the first step, I think, towards sort of valuing and recognizing and celebrating diversity or whatever is to simply encounter difference of that magnitude, and then try to feel, discuss, articulate our way through what encountering difference is like, right? So we see ancient Egypt or any other civilization, we go through and, wow, that's really weird. Okay, now that we understand how different it is, we can start working towards recognizing all of the very similar categories that are functioning in a really weird society and with our own, right? So then we kind of get through different patterns of family life, social hierarchy, basic economic expectations, and then we start realizing, it's actually exactly the way that we operate today, right? It's just, very similar patterns and very different details. Then as we're all doing that together, and hopefully everybody is, made comfortable to talk, we can start recognizing the same sort of gradation between difference and similarity, in our own society and our own interdependence and stuff. Yeah.
And do you find that that's a good way to help students have sort of a deeper understanding, or at least connect with a lot of ancient cultures, at least not on a sympathetic level, but at least like on an empathetic level, or some deeper form of understanding of why those differences are there? And so do you find that it helps them feel like slightly less, or the culture to feel slightly less alien?
Yeah, I think so. And what's really important there, again, is to go back to this question of perspective and motivation and value, right? Because in a lot of ways, human beings have very similar motivations. We want to eat. We want to keep our families alive. And a lot of things after that are sort of derivative, right? And they play out in really weird ways. But if you look at how ancient Egypt or any other society is functioning, and sort of train yourself to ask about their motivations and their values, their fears, I guess is maybe a little culturally valued word, but what are the motivations underlying these bizarre, abhorrent, crazy practices, right? I think we kind of end up with a set of human concerns that are really, really readily recognizable. And then we can obviously apply that same methodology to those weirdos who are sitting next to us in class, and we can't figure out, why do they think this about whatever.
Cool. And diving a little deeper on that, as well as talking about the culture of Egypt as a whole, I remember in your class you talking about various the differences between cultures within Egypt. I remember, for example, the Nubians were like one large one, to name one, but I know there were several others. And why, in your view, is it important for students to conceptualize that even within Egypt, it's an amalgamation of like different cultures to their understanding of ancient Egypt, or Rome as another one. Rome especially, because Rome has a great history of sort of whenever it conquers a culture, it sort of absorbs an amount of that culture.
Right. And in Livy's sort of mythological founding, right? Even the founding narrative of Rome is an amalgamation of a bunch of refugees who are sort of duped into joining this new society, right? So it is easy. It's much, 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 much easier to recognize ourselves and our own culture as being made up of autonomous agents, individuals, human beings, persons, each with a unique set of values, beliefs, motivations, goals, aspirations, etc., right? It's much easier to recognize that in ourselves and in our culture than it is to recognize in another culture. So, I can look at people, whatever, who, look and talk like me and recognize that they're really complicated characters and they have all these things. I look at people who are different and they talk different from me, and I think they're all the same, right? I think all of those people look the same, talk the same, they all think, So, a good example would be like, if we go back to the 50s or whatever, McCarthyism, right? All those, godless Russian commies, they're all exactly the same. But we Americans are complicated, there's lots of diversity and, blah, blah, blah. And we might think the same thing about, the Republicans or the Democrats or the Catholics or the Protestants or whoever, right? So, again, history is the best place to encounter diversity and difference and all that kind of stuff. So when we can go into the past and look at some monolithic ancient culture like Egypt, we have these preconceptions. All Egyptians look like the pharaoh, right? All Egyptians wear the funny head thing, and they all look this way, they all talk this way, they all worship the same gods, right? Because they're all Egyptians and they all look the same gods. So by looking in more detail, we recognize that actually the sort of construct of ancient Egypt can be deconstructed and complexified, right? And we can see all of this diversity coming together to make this like really incredible mosaic instead of one monolithic like stone statue, right? All Egyptians are just the Sphinx, that's it. But again, what we're doing, I think, in the study of history is training ourselves to think about society and diversity and our own worlds. So if we can do that with ancient Egypt, hopefully we can do that today with the people on the other side of the political spectrum or the other side of the religious spectrum or racial or whatever, right? And recognize wow, every society is made up of a bunch of crazy individuals that are all really weird and different, and we have to move collectively, I think, from dealing with human beings as these giant monolithic blocks to being able to see other human beings as actual persons, individuals with complicated life stories and all that kind of stuff.
So, sort of in summing up there is that by exploring diversity in history, we sort of help help prevent the process of othering, if we'll use that term,
sure
today.
Yeah, exactly.
It's very easy to other.
Yeah, and I think right, and it's probably the easiest to other people in the past, right? Because they're so just completely crazy and weird. But when we can recognize how integrated, not that these are always examples of integration, but how complex these ancient societies were, we recognize how personable each facet of society is. That helps to prevent us from doing that in the present as well, ideally.
Awesome. And so how does that, sort of your approach in teaching that, how has that been sort of received both by, most importantly, students, and then any notes or comments and stuff you get from faculty or anything like that? Sort of do you run into any common resistances, or you get what's sort of the common response to sort of your approach in the presentation?
I don't know of any resistance. I think that is pretty much liked here, at least by other faculty, and it seems like the students like it too, because you're talking about othering, right? Mm-hmm. One of the real problems with the study of history is that it's just a bunch of other stuff that is just nonsense, and it's all dead and gone, so it's just worthless, right? So if we can de-other it, we actually make it relevant to our own, lives, right? And so then, this is the good response, the evaluations that I like from classes. People recognize that, and they recognize that studying the past actually does illumine their own traditions to themselves, and also illumines, their other traditions to them as well. It makes the modern world a little bit more intelligible or navigable, from studying it this way. Yeah.
Cool. It helps sort of. What's the word I'm looking for here? It helps them sort of process and conceptualize sort of the origins of a lot of othering too. They can sort of trace stuff. Oh, that's where this whole bias towards whatever other group we're talking about sort of originates. I find that's a really interesting facet of history too. You can sort of trace it back to the beginning of that's why this group, this cultural group, and this cultural group don't like each other, or why the opinion of this cultural group has arisen and stuff. For sure, that.
Yeah, and I think some of those direct connections they start. It's more and more possible to make those connections in the less ancient past, right? But not. I mean, even with Rome, right? We get the origin of some world religions, and then we run into Islam, and now we can really talk about some modern stereotypes and where some of this stuff is coming from, right? But even before that, with ancient Egypt, which is kind of a ways before anything that's recognizable to most students in terms of modern geopolitical, social prejudice and that kind of stuff, we can still see the patterns and the sort of political, rhetorical agenda at work, right? What does the king have to do? The king has to, dehumanize his enemies, right? The king has to motivate the peasants to see their own good in his own good, and so we have to talk about the enemy in a certain way, right? We get all the same patterns, even in the super ancient history. Yeah.
Or the case for the people that are culturally Jewish, like treading back to the medieval period where they were all bankers and stuff, and no one wants to own money to the bankers. So that's why and the whole like mythical goblins like sort of were a racial sort of a really really old version of a racially offensive sort of cartooning of like Jewish people and stuff like that. So
yeah.
And so, going off of that, do you, talking about perspective and sort of exploring diversity to negate othering, do you find in your studies and stuff of any biases, particularly in Egypt, since we're talking about Egypt as an example, with regards to Egyptian history or Egypt as a culture? And if so, where do you sort of think that might come from?
So, you mean kind of like scholarly
biases or something, or perception issues that aren't necessarily the most productive or sort of ignorant to certain aspects of Egyptian culture, and sort of I find that historical narratives get sort of created in regards to certain cultures that sort of get perpetuated and
yeah, for sure. And Egypt, very very clearly so. I mean, ancient Egypt is very heavily colored by this sort of modern inheritance of medieval myth that then is sort of highlighted and written upon ancient Egypt right through the historiography that we did to some degree in that ancient Egypt class, looking at the role of the French and the British after Napoleon and then after the British Mandate, after the Great War and everything, and just the heavy-handed European influence in the early research in Egypt and the sort of kidnapping of artifacts and all this stuff, but also in the writing of the narratives. So I mean, Egypt is a great example of that, where Egypt, like a lot of things in the ancient world, the ascendant Western Europeans are able to get their hands on it and use it as an idealized other, as a canvas upon which to write their own ideals about Western ascendancy, right? Which is the same thing that is done with the Jews, right? The Jews after Christianity's ascendancy, in the especially about the 5th century, with Augustine's characterizing them in certain sort of biblical ways, right? And then all kinds of stuff that happens after that. The same with the Romans themselves, right? The Byzantines, whoever they are, Greek civilization, by Western Europeans. So Egypt is almost more easily idealistically otherized by the Westerners because of the early kidnapping of the evidence, right, from Egypt. What I was kind of interested by as I was going through that class was recognizing there's almost like an ironic loop that happens in this criticism of the historiography, right? So there was a real Egypt, right? There were real Egyptians, and they did lots of stuff. We don't get to hear about any of those because we just have these British and French people running around, right? And then we have this big critique of the fact that all the archaeologists are European and the Egyptians don't, they get one kind of museum off to the side, but all the Europeans get all the good stuff. And so we can be indignant at that and recognize that is like sort of a bad way to go about history. But then that can itself be sort of ossified, and then we can lose track of actually a whole slew of Egyptian archaeologists and historians that have come about, even in the early 20th century, but more so in the later 20th century. So we have to deconstruct the construction of the European otherization of Egypt. Maybe listen to that sentence again to see if it makes any sense, right? So, what I'm trying to get at is it's sort of interesting how, at first, the story of Egypt is totally buried by this European historiography. But it doesn't stay that way. And so now we do have, plenty of Egyptian historians that are retaining ownership of the Egyptian story, right? And so we kind of have to rewrite this rewriting to recognize now a more authentic historiographicalization of ancient Egypt. Yeah.
Yeah, and I find that there's sort of this, at least in a lot of film and television, and that has its own issues there. But also in certain academic things, I sort of get, I think this comes from the European flavoring of the historiography, is that Egypt is always sort of depicted as this sort of opulent, sort of culty, religious culture, where it's, strictly like the pharaohs and his or her priests, and then that's it basically, and then everyone else is sort of used to serve, and that's the classic thing you always get depicted like in film and television and stuff like that. And do you find I find that narrative is also being sort of corrected. Do you find that that's being corrected, and do you find that it's also sort of connected to that European framing of the narrative of the historiography of Egypt?
Yeah, I think so. And over time, we get better and better technology to do better and better archaeology, right? So Egypt is a great case study for this, right? We get the best sources of everything from Egypt, right? Even if we want to study, medieval Judaism, we still go to Egypt to find like the texts and stuff, buried in the dry sand, right? We get dry sand and we get stones, and that tells us all this cool stuff, primarily about the priests and the pharaohs and that kind of stuff. Now, though, we have all these other archaeologists that are working on, the drunk workers with influenza having to stay home from work with diarrhea, and who's sort of taking care of them I forget the modern name, but in Amarna, right? So now we can do this archaeology of like the worker campsites, and we can find their pay stubs, and we can find their letters like, hey, so and so has the runs again, he can't go into work. We get this like, oh shit, like Egyptians are people, right? And they're eating and drinking and getting sick, and they have all kinds of family strife and all this kind of stuff. Lo and behold, there are a lot of people besides the pharaohs and the priests. However, though, what's weird about that is that we can recognize that, sort of like in graduate school, I think you get more recognition of this, right? And then, further in researching. The problem, though, is that kind of evidence is more difficult to deal with, right? Like, for a freshman survey or something, like, we can't go through all of these archaeological sites and, like, explain all of the methodology and the sources and everything to talk about all this. In a survey, you're going to talk about the pharaoh, you're going to read, like, a couple inscriptions from some temple, and then you're going to move on to something else. So even though scholarship is moving in this direction, it's, like, decades, I think, before it can really fully trickle down into like regular undergraduate instruction. At least to the same degree, right? I mean, we can say flippant little things about how historiography changes, but I don't think you can really address that to the same degree until upper class or graduate.
The time and the comprehension level sort of catches up to that. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so going off of that, do you ever encounter students that sort of exhibiting some of these biases and stuff that come up, and then when you do, or if you do encounter that, sort of what's your approach to deal with it in sort of an ethical and sort of productive manner?
Yeah, I do. I do not often, but and usually pretty vaguely. I think there's only been one instance of somebody kind of like saying some stuff that really seemed strange to me, right, and kind of like not politically correct or whatever. But generally, I mean, yeah, all of us say all kinds of ridiculous, ignorant things about others, right? I mean, we say it about ourselves too, but I think basically what I try to do is to help students specify what they mean by certain terms, right? And the worst terms ever are them and their, right? Okay, well, who are you talking about? I'm talking about Egyptians. Which Egyptians, right? The rich ones, the poor ones, the men ones, the women ones, the ones from Thebes or the ones from Memphis. I don't know, the Libyans or the Nubians, right?
Yeah.
And again, like by trying to focus on specification and try to personify the other instead of just this them that's opaque and whatever. Most students don't resist that. They recognize, oh yeah, I do have this like vague impression of who they are. It's not that we're necessarily prejudiced against them. We just don't know, right?
Right.
And so that's really what I think history these days is trying to do, is to teach people how to think about others who they don't know and get to know them so they stop being other,
Yeah, personifying them. That's
Yeah.
really great.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And so how would you, bouncing off that, how would you like to see the conversation change about Egypt, both academically and socially, in regards to like how Egyptian culture and history is sort of viewed and framed?
Oh, that's a great question. By which I mean I don't know.
Well, is there any like spots where you're like, I don't really think that's like a fair assessment, or sort of some of those biases that you mentioned that seem to perpetuate and aren't changing to the degree that you think is productive in the sort of the reclaiming of the Egyptian historiography and archaeology?
Yeah. Well, I think one direction that will never be satisfied, but continue to work on is in the to try to better understand Egyptian religion, which is so problematic because first off, like nobody really knows what religion is to start with, right? We know what Christianity and Judaism are, and maybe what Islam is, from a European historiographical perspective.
Sort of,
right?
Yeah.
But then it turns out, well, I don't know, we don't really know that either. So what the hell is Egyptian religion? I mean, that's like even more difficult. But I would say that's, or I don't know, from my perspective, that's where to go to try to fully personalize an other, is in their understanding of the all, right? What is the ultimate cosmology that you're working in? What is the ultimate like ethical framework that you're working in? And how do you relate to those around you, right? And those generally kind of fit in this idea of religion, right? What made the world? How do we relate to each other, and what is good and bad, right? But like we were saying earlier, pretty much we have a lot of good evidence about like some of the pharaohs, and then later, later dynastic summaries of earlier Egyptian religion. But to try to figure out like what real Egyptians thought about those questions is so difficult. And I think archaeology is coming along. We're getting better methodologies, and that's unfortunately, like for me, I'm really trained in sort of textual history, so a lot of Egypt actually is really difficult for me to understand because of the archaeological methodology that's necessary to get better answers to these questions. But I think it is coming along, and we do get more and more understanding of those kinds of answers. But anyways, that's really important because there aren't, to my knowledge, if so, there aren't many, traditional ancient Egyptian religionists out there, right? There are Christians and there are Jews and there are Muslims. And of course there are, nuns, right? Secular people, obviously, in Egypt. But from all of their perspectives, ancient Egyptian religion is weird and bad and polytheistic and strange, right? Because, I mean, right, you can't, like, there's lots of gods, they're incomprehensible, right? None of them is going to be sanctioned by any of the great monotheistic religions of modernity.
Right.
So, it's sort of like, even if we could recapture the past from, instead of a Western European, from an Islamic perspective, it's still a pagan past. It's still a weird, unenlightened, not yet revealed truth past, right? And so I think it still stays in this kind of subaltern way. And that's true for secular scholars too, right? From a secular perspective, well, all of this is a bunch of weird, mythology.
Like
anyways.
Old Testament even versus New Testament
Right,
stuff.
yeah, yeah.
It's weird and dated.
Yep.
Wholly not applicable to,
Yeah, so it's good, it's probably impossible or difficult for modern people to see the world as ancient Egyptians did, but I think that's kind of like where we should be trying to go, right? And again, in the context of this conversation, that is kind of one of the last remnants of trying to personalize an other, right? Because there are plenty of modern religions that are similarly disparaged by Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, right?
Mm-hmm.
So if we could figure out, and secularism, right? So if we could figure out how to really get the ancient Egyptian worldview, we might have a better understanding of how to get a lot of modern people, that are not fitting into these popular religious paradigms.
Yeah, I think perspective's the real tricky thing there, because as someone I'm myself am pagan, so it's not that difficult for me to connect to polytheism in certain ways.
Sure.
But if your sort of concept of the all has been framed in such a way for so long, it's really difficult, I think, for a lot of people to sort of shift perspectives into something else. Another tricky thing about nailing down that Egyptian stuff is that, as I discovered, and the most fascinating thing to me, I think, in the class for the reading material you provided was how different Egyptian religion, from what we can tell, the concepts of it were at any given time, because it would change dynastically almost all the time. And there were times where certain gods would be gods of an aspect, but then they'd also be gods of a region or a cardinal direction maybe, and then relationships between the pharaoh and the god, and then ascension to a god, all that stuff keeps shifting as you go through. Religion, just like any other religion, it was a very organic process and shifted a lot. We don't have as a dense of a written tradition for ancient Egypt as we do for, say, Christianity or other or Islam or other secular.
Yeah,
religions.
that's a great point. I mean, it's from the context of a 10-week quarter. Egyptian religion is constantly changing in all these weird ways, right? But then also when you consider, we're looking at 3 millennia.
It's huge,
right? I mean,
span of time.
Yeah. So, but anyways, religion do change, and this is, I think, maybe another great thing for us modern people to learn, right? Because there's all these religions out there now, and they're all changing, and a lot of religious people, not all by any means, but some, religious people really don't like the idea that religions change. They want their religion to stay the same and be, the truth, which never changes. That's another maybe sort of benefit, from studying this longue durée view of how a traditional religion really does change wildly and dramatically over time. Might give us some insight into how to navigate, modern religious sort of evolution as well. Yeah.
And do you think with the semester system coming in with more time allowed, would that be beneficial to have more time to explore that?
Oh yeah, I mean, yeah, for sure. There's just way too much Egypt. Yeah, definitely. I guess that time has to come from somewhere, and that means you take fewer class or whatever. I don't know, but definitely, if you had 15 weeks or however long it is,
quarters are 17 or something. No, they're not. Are they 17 weeks? I think there's something 15 or 17 weeks.
Yeah, whatever it is. That obviously gives you more time to work with Egypt, which I think would really help. Especially, I mean, there's there's just so many different, radically different, differences in the differentness of this different culture, right?
Yeah.
We need more weeks to get through it.
Well, I assume it's very helpful for Rome or something like that too. I know we're sort of focusing on Egypt, but Rome too, especially with how far it expands and stuff too. The semester would be very beneficial in understanding everything.
Yeah, for both of those classes, there are so many different Egypts and so many different Romes. Which Rome do you want to talk about? There's Western and Eastern and Old and Middle and New and Republican and Imperial and like medieval and like modern and like come on.
Yeah.
So and that's true for I think it would be neat with some extra time to do more. I don't know to what more than like 20 minutes on why what is the legacy of these ancient civilizations, right? Let's like have a full week or two on the role of ancient Egypt in the modern Middle East, or in whatever, the ancient Rome in modern NATO and the Ukraine and all this kind of stuff. These are like really important questions, but there's so much history to do to then get to there. So yeah, more time would be good.
Awesome. And then just finally closing, sort of wrapping it back up and going back to the first one. In your mind, is Cal City a diverse campus, and not just sort of superficially with like we have a diverse population? Because any place can have a diverse population, but do the concepts and stuff and the attitude you find of both the student body and the faculty here like encourage diversity and be truly diverse in concept, and not just like, oh hey, we have a varying degree of students from different backgrounds, but do you feel that sort of that's celebrated and encouraged here?
I'm wondering about the questions, sort of assumptions of, what is true diversity, I guess.
We can go with that.
Yeah, we definitely have a lot of different people around, right? There's the category, and I've sort of struggled with this sometimes on job applications. When you talk, how many different ways can people be different? Well, there's a lot of ways, right? So you got ethnicity and nationality and socioeconomic, all this stuff, right? But then I don't know, politics, right? Religious, this kind of stuff, and I think that this is. I think this is a pretty diverse place. It seems more diverse. There are more differences encountered here than I would say like at Berkeley, where I was before. Different differences than at the Graduate Theological Union, also at Berkeley, which is also like super diverse. In some ways, that school is more diverse in terms of viewpoints, idealisms, worldviews, right? People that are like very motivated towards different and incompatible goals. Whereas here, I think a lot of people are, I don't know, a lot of people are from all kinds of crazy different backgrounds, and they encounter each other and stuff. But it seems that I guess it's so civil here, which is why I'm sort of wondering about the diversity aspect, right? Like, why is it so civil here?
That's a really interesting question.
We should be fighting each other more, because
or should we?
Or should I don't know. This is like so. A friend of mine teaches at USF. And he brought this up last week. He was saying, USF is actually more open-minded than Berkeley because there's a more of a political spectrum, I think was his kind of point. There are more like more fundamental debates about like the value of, I don't know, freedom or authority, something like that.
Yeah,
right?
Berkeley's probably pretty left leaning. I would guess if we'd have to categorize, I don't know, like put a nice little lid on it or whatever, you know, but they seem pretty left leaning.
Yeah, and it seems like, I mean, I would say that's also true of East Bay here.
Mm-hmm.
It seems pretty left leaning, which is not a problem or anything. But I wonder, like, would we be more diverse if we got into more fights about sort of for and against Trump or something, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it came up last quarter. Somebody said something and they just assumed that everybody in class obviously was not in favor of Trump, right? I think this was still during the campaign. It was before his
Oh, okay. Yeah,
and or so not last quarter. I don't know when this was, last year or whatever. And okay, so there was some resistance, right? There was some like, hey, we can't just assume that everybody's this diversity-loving leftist gorilla here because we're in the East Bay, right?
Right.
But I wonder, like, I don't know, should that come up more? Would that come up more if we were more diverse? And would that be desirable? Or, is total relativistic diversity like necessarily the goal? Or, I don't know. It's
relative versus true diversity. So you're sort of saying, like, would it be more beneficial to have maybe not more arguments or more fights, but like more discussion about that, like open, frank discussion about it, rather than sort of skirting around it.
Right.
Sort of
can you really be diverse if everybody agrees that diversity is what you're seeking? I mean, it's sort of like a homogenized diversity from the get-go, right? Which, I mean, I'm not criticizing. I'm not like trying to like argue for some totalitarianism here or something. But no, it's just coming up because we were just talking about this in class today, the sort of relative view of loyalty to the state or to the family in ancient China, right? And who's to say where these values, which values are better? And do we really want diversity? Because if everyone has their own perspective on truth, then don't we stop being academic and we all just kind of make up our own mythologies and stuff? I don't know. It's a very awesome abstract question.
Very big, big thing to tackle. Yeah.
But in the more practical sense, it's an incredibly diverse group of students and faculty. Which is great, and it definitely keeps me on my toes all the time because I'm not from a diverse background. I grew up in a very non-diverse, very sort of country white Southern California, but super white and not into diversity at all. So in my own education process, I've learned and sort of expanded my horizons, right? But still, we're formed by these narratives that we're formed by, right? And so coming to the task of teaching and instructing, as we were saying, try to, how can I be less Eurocentric and blah 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 blah. It's a great place to do that here because it really is like you're challenged at every step of the way. Me as like obviously a European American, right, and a male, right? Mm-hmm. It's nice to be consistently challenged to look at my own biases and my own ethnocentrism, right, on a daily basis in every conversation with every student, right? So in that sense, more practically, yes, we are diverse, and I think that's great.
Thank you very much, man. That was a really great interview.
Sure, thank you.
Great stuff there.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.